She challenged the cold Mafia billionaire. Now he refuses to let her go. You will be with me tonight. Hello, lovely ones. Welcome to Dr. Tom's Love Family, where every story is a journey of love and emotions. I'm your host, Dr. Tom, and now I ask you, how are you doing today? I ask because each moment you spend here fills my heart with such gratitude that I sometimes forget how to breathe. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. It makes me happy seeing my stories reach hearts all around the world. Also, if you enjoy heartfelt love stories that touch your soul and remind you of the power of true connection, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a new tale of romance and passion. Now, let's begin. The 52nd floor of Anson Towers commanded a view that stretched across Manhattan like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the morning sun, casting golden light across the mahogany conference table where billion-dollar decisions were made daily. But for Anson Wright, the view represented something far more complex than mere real estate. It was a chessboard where he moved pieces that most people never even knew existed. At 32, Anson ruled two distinct empires with equal ruthlessness. By day, he was the youngest CEO in the history of Wright Industries, a legitimate conglomerate that had grown from a single construction company into a multinational powerhouse. His business acumen was legendary on Wall Street, his name whispered in boardrooms across the globe with equal parts respect and fear. But as the sun set over the city each evening, Anson shed his corporate persona like a snake shedding skin, revealing something far more dangerous beneath. Standing at 6 feet with dark hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, Anson possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His steel-gray eyes had seen too much, reflected too many dark truths that polite society preferred to ignore. The tailored suits that cost more than most people's yearly salaries couldn't hide the predatory grace with which he moved. The way his hands remained steady, whether signing contracts or making decisions that would never appear in any corporate report. The memories haunted him still, surfacing at unexpected moments like ghosts refusing to rest. He could still feel the weight of his mother's lifeless hand in his 10-year-old grip, still hear the mechanical beeping of hospital machines that had failed to save her. The car accident had been sudden, violent, and completely senseless. A drunk driver running a red light, destroying the only source of unconditional love Anson had ever known. "Your mother's gone, boy," his father had said with the emotional depth of someone discussing weather. "Helen will be your new mother now. You'll respect her as such." Helen Wright had been beautiful in the way that expensive things often were. Polished, perfect, and completely hollow inside. She'd married his father for money and status, and the 10-year-old boy grieving his mother's death had been nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. "You're nothing but a burden," Helen had hissed during one of their daily confrontations, her manicured fingers gripping his arm hard enough to leave bruises. "No one will ever love you. You're damaged goods, just like your pathetic mother." The words had cut deeper than any physical wound, burrowing into his young heart like poison. His father, consumed with building his business empire, had been either oblivious to the cruelty or simply unwilling to acknowledge it. Days turned into months, months into years, and the bright, loving child Anson had once been slowly froze into something harder, colder, more calculating. At 14, he'd made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Rather than endure another day of Helen's psychological warfare, he'd packed a single backpack and walked out of the mansion that had never felt like home. The streets of New York had been brutal teachers, but they'd been honest in their brutality. Unlike the polished cruelty of his stepmother, the urban jungle made no pretense about its dangers. Survival had required adaptation. The soft, privileged boy who'd once believed in fairness and kindness had died in those first weeks on the streets. In his place emerged something harder, more resilient, infinitely more dangerous. Anson learned to read people like open books, to identify weaknesses and exploit them before others could do the same to him. He discovered that fear was a more reliable motivator than friendship, that power was the only currency that truly mattered. The transformation hadn't been immediate. It had taken years of careful planning, strategic alliances, and calculated risks. But by the time he'd reached his mid-20s, Anson had built something unprecedented. A shadow empire that operated in the spaces between legal and illegal, profitable and dangerous. He'd become the man people whispered about in hushed tones, the one they came to when legitimate channels failed them. Now, 18 years after that 14-year-old boy had walked away from everything he'd known, Anson sat in his corporate throne room, master of two worlds that existed in perfect, terrifying balance. The legitimate business provided cover and respectability. The shadow empire provided the real power, the ability to solve problems that existed beyond the reach of law and order. His reflection in the conference room windows showed a man who had achieved everything he'd ever wanted: wealth, influence, fear, respect. Yet the victory felt hollow, like eating expensive food that had no taste. Success had been his obsession for so long that he'd forgotten what came after achieving it. Mr. Wright, his assistant James, knocked softly on the door, interrupting his brooding. "Your 2 o'clock appointment is here." The audit consultant from Mitchell & Associates. Anson didn't look up from the quarterly reports spread across his desk. Another day, another professional obligation to be endured. "Send her in." The door opened with a soft click, and Caroline Mitchell entered the conference room with the kind of quiet confidence that immediately commanded attention. She wore a simple navy dress that managed to look both professional and elegant, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun that framed her face perfectly. But it was her eyes that made Anson finally look up from his papers, intelligent gray-green depths that seemed to see through the carefully constructed facades that most people accepted without question. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt genuine rather than calculated. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I'm Caroline Mitchell, and I'm here about the financial discrepancies we've identified in your overseas accounts." Anson gestured to the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, studying her with the intensity that had made grown men confess their deepest secrets. Most people wilted under that stare, rushing to fill the silence with nervous chatter that revealed more than they intended. Caroline simply settled into the chair with graceful precision, opened her briefcase, and waited. "Miss Mitchell," he said finally, his voice carrying the chill that had become his trademark. "Your firm's reputation precedes you. I'm told you're quite thorough in your investigations." "I try to be," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Though I have to admit, I'm more interested in the accuracy of the numbers than any reputation they might create." The response intrigued him. Most people who entered his office were either intimidated by his presence or desperate to impress him. Caroline seemed to be neither, treating their meeting as simply another professional obligation to be handled with competence and efficiency. "Tell me what you found," he said, leaning back in his chair and using silence as a weapon the way he always did. Caroline spread documents across his desk with methodical precision, her movements economical and purposeful. "We've identified unusual transfer patterns over the past 6 months. Payments that don't correspond to any legitimate business expenses listed in your corporate filings." Anson moved closer, ostensibly to examine the documents she was showing him. The subtle scent of jasmine mixed with something uniquely her own made his pulse quicken in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "How unusual. $50 million in transfers over the past 6 months, she said, looking up to meet his eyes. Their faces were suddenly inches apart, and he could see flecks of gold in her gray-green irises. "Either someone is embezzling substantial amounts from your company, or you're hiding something significant." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down by a knight before a king. Anson studied Caroline's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the way her breathing had quickened slightly when he'd moved closer, the complete absence of fear that made her so different from everyone else who entered his domain. "That's quite an accusation, Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to remind her who she was dealing with. "It's not an accusation," she replied, her tone remaining steady and professional. "It's an observation based on the available data. I don't make assumptions about my clients' business practices. I simply identify patterns that require explanation." The response surprised him. Most people would have backtracked by now, offered apologies and assurances that they hadn't meant to imply anything inappropriate. Caroline seemed genuinely uninterested in the power dynamics that govern most of his interactions. "You're very thorough," he observed, settling back into his chair to put some distance between them. Most consultants would have missed patterns this subtle. "I have to be thorough," she said, gathering some of the documents and organizing them with practiced efficiency. "My family depends on this job, and I can't afford to miss details that might be important." Something in her voice, a vulnerability carefully masked by professional competence, cracked through his emotional armor in a way that nothing had for years. "Family? My mother and younger siblings," she said, then seemed to realize she'd shared more personal information than she'd intended. "But personal matters don't affect my professional judgment, Mr. Wright. I'm here to do a job, and I intend to do it well. Anson stood abruptly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked his urban kingdom. The city sprawled below them, but he was seeing something else entirely. A 14-year-old boy sleeping in doorways, swearing he'd never be vulnerable again, never care about anyone enough to be hurt by their loss. "Continue your investigation, Miss Mitchell," he said without turning around. "You'll have full access to whatever records you need to examine." "Even the accounts you'd prefer I didn't see?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she already knew the answer. He turned to face her, surprised by her directness. "Especially those." Caroline began gathering her papers, moving with the same efficient grace she'd displayed throughout their meeting. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Mr. Wright," she said softly, "the numbers don't lie, but sometimes they don't tell the whole truth either." After she left, Anson stood alone in his office, loosening his tie for the first time in months. The simple gesture felt strange, foreign, like a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Caroline Mitchell had just walked into his carefully constructed world, and somehow, the shadows that had been his comfort for 18 years didn't feel quite as protective as they once had. The warehouse on the Lower East Side existed in a different universe from the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district. Here, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and surrounded by the smell of rust and old concrete, Anson conducted the business that would never appear in any corporate report. This was his shadow kingdom, the place where problems were solved through methods that polite society preferred to ignore. Vincent Torino had been with him for 8 years, ever since Anson had pulled him out of a territorial dispute that would have left him dead in an alley. Loyalty purchased through salvation was the strongest kind, and Vincent had proven his worth 1,000 times over. His scarred face told the story of a man who'd survived things that would have broken weaker people, and his dark eyes held the kind of intelligence that came from years of reading danger in the faces of desperate men. "The Kozlov brothers are pushing back on the docks," Vincent reported, his voice carrying the weight of bad news delivered with professional efficiency. "They think your legitimate business ventures are making you soft." Anson's voice when he responded carried the chill of winter steel. "Then remind them why they're mistaken." "Already handled, boss, but there's something else we need to discuss." The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the shadows. Anson had learned to read the rhythms of his organization like a conductor reading a score, and he could sense tension in the air like static before a storm. "What kind of something else?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. Vincent hesitated, which was unusual for a man who'd faced down armed killers without blinking. "Word is the Kozlovs are looking for leverage against you. They can't touch your business operations directly, so they're exploring other options." "What kind of leverage?" "The personal kind," Vincent said carefully. "They've been asking questions about your associations, people you might care about." Anson felt ice form in his veins, the familiar cold that had kept him alive through 18 years of dangerous games. In his world, emotional attachments were weapons that enemies could use against you. The smart play was to avoid them entirely, to remain isolated and untouchable. "Double the security on all our operations," he said, his voice betraying none of the concern that was building in his chest. "And Vincent, anyone who even looks at my business interests the wrong way disappears, permanently." Vincent nodded, understanding the implications without needing them spelled out. "What about the girl, the consultant?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired gun. Anson had been careful to keep his two worlds separate, to ensure that his legitimate business never intersected with his shadow empire. But Caroline Mitchell represented something new, something that didn't fit neatly into either category. "What about her?" Anson asked, though his tone suggested the question was more dangerous than it appeared. "She's smart, boss. Smarter than most. If she keeps digging into those accounts, she might find connections we'd prefer stayed hidden." The truth was that Anson had been thinking about Caroline Mitchell far more than was wise or safe. There had been something in her eyes during their meeting, a combination of intelligence and fearlessness that had intrigued him in ways he couldn't quite understand. She hadn't been intimidated by his reputation or impressed by his wealth, treating him simply as another client to be managed professionally. "Handle it carefully," he said finally. "She's investigating financial irregularities, not conducting a criminal investigation. As long as she stays focused on the numbers, there shouldn't be any problems." Vincent's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he nodded anyway. "And if she doesn't stay focused on the numbers?" Anson considered the question, thinking about gray-green eyes and the way Caroline had looked at him without fear. Then we'll deal with that situation when it develops. As Vincent left to carry out his orders, Anson remained in the warehouse, surrounded by the trappings of his shadow empire. For 18 years, this world had been enough. The power, the fear, the ability to solve problems that existed beyond the reach of law and order. It had filled the void left by his mother's death and his father's betrayal. But now, for the first time in years, Anson found himself wondering what it would be like to care about someone again. The thought terrified him more than any threat from the Kozlov brothers ever could. Because in his world, the moment you started caring about someone was the moment you gave your enemies the weapon they needed to destroy you. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Anson's office as Caroline Mitchell entered for their third scheduled meeting. But this time, she carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, and the simple gesture sent an unexpected warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with the beverage's temperature. "You look like you don't sleep much," she observed, setting 1 cup on his desk before settling into what had become her usual chair. "I thought you might need this." Anson accepted the coffee, surprised by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. In his world, people brought him things because they wanted something in return, not because they noticed he looked tired. Sleep is for people who don't have empires to run. Is that what you call it? An empire? Caroline opened her laptop with practiced efficiency, but there was something different in her demeanor today, a warmth that hadn't been there during their previous meetings. "I've been thinking about these financial patterns we discussed. They're too organized to be random theft, too systematic to be coincidental. And your conclusion?" She met his eyes across the desk, and he found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. "You're paying for services that can't be listed on any legitimate balance sheet. Protection, maybe, or favors that exist outside normal business channels." The observation was dangerously close to the truth, but Anson found himself more intrigued than threatened. "That's quite a leap from financial irregularities to criminal activity." "I'm not making accusations," Caroline said, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "I'm simply trying to understand the man behind the numbers." "Salatrimal Sigishi, and the numbers suggest someone who's carrying burdens that most people never see." Over the following weeks, their daily meetings became the highlight of Anson's otherwise ruthless existence. Caroline would arrive each morning with coffee and a smile that made his sterile office feel warmer, more human. She had a way of asking questions that felt more like genuine curiosity than professional interrogation. "I noticed something interesting in your personal accounts," she said during one of their sessions, pulling up a spreadsheet on her laptop. "Regular donations to St. Mary's Children's Home. Anonymous contributions that have been going on for years." Anson's jaw tightened. Those donations were supposed to be untraceable, hidden behind layers of shell companies and legal maneuvering. "I don't know what you're talking about. You also personally funded college scholarships for 3 kids who aged out of the foster system," Caroline continued, her voice gentle rather than accusatory. "And there's a pattern of payments to families who've lost breadwinners in construction accidents. Always anonymous, always exactly enough to cover funeral expenses and living costs for 6 months." The evidence of his hidden compassion spread across her screen like a roadmap to vulnerabilities he'd tried to bury. "You're very thorough, Miss Mitchell." "I'm thorough because I care about accuracy, but I also care about understanding the people behind the numbers." She closed the laptop and looked at him directly. "I know you're not as cold as you pretend to be." The words hit him like a physical blow. For 18 years, he'd cultivated his reputation as a man without weaknesses, someone who made decisions based on logic rather than emotion. But Caroline had found the cracks in his armor, the places where his humanity still leaked through despite his best efforts to contain it. "You don't know anything about me," he said, standing abruptly and walking to the windows that overlooked his domain. "I know you're in pain," she said softly, and her voice carried a gentleness that made something in his chest ache. "I know you're carrying guilt and anger that you think you have to handle alone, and I know you're the loneliest man I've ever met." The observation cut deeper than any blade ever could. Anson had learned to live with isolation, to wear loneliness like armor that protected him from further hurt. But hearing Caroline name it so accurately made the weight of his solitude feel suddenly unbearable. "Loneliness is a choice," he said, not turning around. "Some people are meant to stand alone. No one is meant to stand alone," Caroline replied, and he could hear her moving closer. "Especially not someone who gives so much while pretending to care about nothing." When he finally turned, she was standing just a few feet away, her gray-green eyes reflecting something that looked like concern mixed with understanding. The distance between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, and Anson found himself studying her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with business. "Caroline," he said, her name feeling strange on his lips after weeks of formal address. "Yes. You should be careful around me. I'm not the kind of man who builds things. I'm the kind who destroys them." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, jasmine mixed with something uniquely her own. "Maybe you've just been destroying the wrong things." The closeness making them feel more intimate rather than what was being discussed. Anson pulled her into a kiss. The kiss was inevitable, electric, life-changing. Anson had kissed women before, but never with the desperation that suddenly consumed him. Caroline's lips were soft and warm, and when she responded by sliding her hands up his chest, he felt something that had been frozen for 18 years finally begin to thaw. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the professional boundaries that had defined their relationship lay in ruins around them. "This changes everything," Caroline whispered, her forehead resting against his. "Everything was already changing," Anson replied, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment you walked into my office with those numbers that told stories I thought no one would ever read." The weeks that followed their first kiss transformed Anson's existence in ways he'd never thought possible. Caroline's investigation into his financial accounts became secondary to the investigation of each other, professional meetings evolving into something that felt suspiciously like courtship. She would arrive at his office in the mornings with coffee and a smile that made his heart race, in ways that had nothing to do with caffeine. Their conversations ranged from business to philosophy, from shared stories of childhood to dreams they'd never admitted to anyone else. For the first time in 18 years, Anson found himself looking forward to something that had nothing to do with power or profit. "Tell me about your family," he said one evening as they shared dinner in his office, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows like earthbound stars. Caroline's expression softened, and he could see the love in her eyes when she spoke about the people who mattered most to her. "My mother works 2 jobs to keep us afloat. She's been doing it since my father died when I was 16. My sister Jessica is in her senior year of high school, and my brother Tommy is 12 and believes he's going to be a professional baseball player. And they all depend on you." "I'm all they have," she said simply. "My mother sacrificed everything to make sure I could go to college, get a good job, build a stable life. Everything I do is for them." The fierce protectiveness in her voice resonated with something deep in Anson's chest. He understood responsibility, the weight of carrying others' hopes and dreams. But Caroline's burden was born from love, while his had been forged from survival and revenge. "Would you like to meet them?" Caroline asked, and the question caught him off guard. "Meet them? Tommy has a game this weekend. Jessica's performing in the school play next week. I know it's not your usual kind of entertainment, but they're important to me." The idea of entering Caroline's world, of being introduced to the people she loved most, should have terrified him. Instead, Anson found himself nodding. "I'd like that." The suburban house where Caroline's family lived was a universe away from the penthouses and corporate towers that defined Anson's existence. It was small, modestly furnished, but filled with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. Photos covered every surface, capturing moments of joy and celebration that had nothing to do with business success or financial achievement. "Mom, this is Anson," Caroline said, introducing him to a woman whose tired eyes lit up when she looked at her daughter. "Anson, this is my mother, Patricia." Patricia Mitchell was clearly Caroline's mother, sharing the same intelligent eyes and warm smile. But there was a weariness in her face that spoke of years of struggle, of sacrifices made for the sake of her children's futures. "It's lovely to meet you," Patricia said, extending a hand that was rough from years of manual labor. "Caroline speaks about you often." "All good things, I hope," Anson replied, and found himself meaning it more than he'd expected. Dinner was a revelation. The food was simple but delicious, the conversation flowing easily between topics that ranged from Tommy's batting average to Jessica's college applications. For the first time in 18 years, Anson sat at a table where people seemed genuinely happy to be in each other's company. "So what do you do, Anson?" Jessica asked, her teenage directness cutting through the polite conversation. "I run a business," he said carefully. "Several businesses, actually." "What kind of businesses?" Caroline caught his eye across the table, and he could see the question in her expression. How much truth was safe to share? How much of his world could be revealed without destroying the fragile connection they'd built? "Construction, mostly. Real estate development. import and export operations. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. The shadow empire that had consumed his life for 18 years remained hidden, a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. Later that evening, as they walked through the neighborhood where Caroline had grown up, she took his hand in hers. The simple gesture sent warmth through his entire body. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "I know this isn't your usual environment." "It's perfect," Anson replied, and realized he meant it completely. "Your family is perfect. They liked you too, I could tell." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their footsteps echoing off the quiet residential streets. But Anson could feel the weight of his secrets pressing down on him, threatening to crush the fragile happiness he'd found. "Caroline," he said finally, "there are things about me that you don't know. Things that might change how you feel about me." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "We all have secrets, Anson. The question is whether they define us or whether we define them. What if the secrets are dangerous? What if they could hurt the people you care about?" Caroline studied his face in the dim streetlight, and he could see her mind working through the implications of his words. "Then we figure out how to handle them together." The trust in her voice made his chest ache with emotions he'd thought were dead and buried. For 18 years, he'd handled everything alone, trusting no one completely. But Caroline was offering something he'd never had: partnership, understanding, the possibility of sharing his burdens instead of carrying them in isolation. "I love you," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Caroline's eyes widened, and for a moment he was terrified that he'd moved too fast, revealed too much. But then she smiled, and the warmth in her expression made his heart skip beats. "I love you too," she whispered, rising on her toes to kiss him under the suburban streetlight. "Whatever secrets you're carrying, we'll face them together." The phone call came at 3 in the morning. Caroline's voice tight with fear and confusion, cutting through the darkness of Anson's penthouse bedroom. "Something's wrong," she said without preamble. "My apartment was broken into tonight. Nothing was taken, but they left a message." Anson was already reaching for his clothes, his mind instantly shifting into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive for 18 years. "What kind of message?" "It was written on my bathroom mirror in what looked like lipstick. It said, 'Tell your boss we know about the shadows.'" The words hit him like a physical blow. The Kozlov brothers had made their move, and they'd chosen the one target that could destroy him completely. "Are you hurt? Is your family safe?" "I'm fine, but I'm scared." "What does this mean, Anson? What shadows are they talking about?" "I'm coming over. Don't go anywhere. Don't let anyone in until I get there." Within 20 minutes, Anson was at Caroline's apartment building, his security detail establishing a perimeter while he took the stairs 2 at a time. He found her sitting on her couch, still in her pajamas, trying to comfort her 10-year-old brother Tommy, who was crying quietly. "They were here when it happened," Caroline said, her voice breaking. "Tommy saw them leaving, but they didn't hurt him. They just left the message and walked away." Anson knelt beside Tommy, his heart breaking at the fear in the child's eyes. "You're safe now, buddy. I promise no one's going to hurt you or your family." Caroline said. "You're her boyfriend," Tommy said, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "Are you going to protect us?" "Yes," Anson said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. "I'm going to protect all of you." After Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch, Caroline led Anson to her bedroom, where they could talk privately. The intimacy of the space, her books on the nightstand, clothes folded neatly in the chair, the subtle scent of her perfume lingering in the air, made the danger feel even more real. "I need to tell you something," Anson said, sitting on the edge of her bed, "about who I really am and why people are trying to hurt you." Caroline settled beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I already know more than you think I do." "What do you know?" "I know the financial irregularities in your accounts aren't random. I know you're involved in businesses that don't appear on any corporate filing. And I know that whoever broke into my apartment tonight sees you as their boss." The truth hung between them like a loaded weapon. Anson had spent weeks trying to protect Caroline from this reality, but the Kozlov brothers had forced his hand. There was no more hiding, no more carefully constructed barriers between his two worlds. "I'm what people call a crime boss," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I run legitimate businesses, but I also control territory, settle disputes, solve problems that exist outside the law." Caroline was quiet for a long moment, and Anson could practically hear her processing the information. "Are you telling me you're in the mafia, among other things, and your enemies are targeting me to get to you?" Anson's jaw tightened, rage building in his chest at the thought of anyone threatening the woman he loved. "I'll handle it." "How?" "By eliminating them. If necessary." Caroline stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the street where his security team was maintaining watch. "This is insane. My family can't be part of this world." "You don't have to be," Anson said, following her across the room. "I'll end it." She turned to face him, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "End what?" "All of it. The Shadow Empire, the territory wars, the violence. I'll walk away from everything." "You can't just walk away from the Mafia, Anson. People don't retire from that kind of life." "I can if the alternative is losing you." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Caroline studied his face in the dim light filtering through her bedroom window, searching for any sign that he was offering false hope or empty promises. "You'd give up everything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your power, your empire, everything you've built." "Now, it's not worth anything without you," Anson replied, and the raw honesty in his voice made her eyes fill with tears. "I spent 18 years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that isolation was strength. But you walked into my life and showed me what I was really hiding from. And what was that? Love, connection, the possibility that someone might actually care about me for who I am instead of what I can do for them." Caroline moved closer, her hands coming up to frame his face. "I do care about you. More than I've ever cared about anyone. But I can't let my family be put in danger because of my feelings." "They won't be in danger," Anson said with the kind of certainty that came from absolute commitment. "I'll dismantle everything, dissolve every connection, eliminate every threat. The Kozlov brothers will be handled, and after that, there will be no more Shadow Empire for enemies to target. And if they don't let you walk away, then I'll convince them that letting me go is in their best interest." Caroline searched his eyes, and Anson let her see everything: the love, the determination, the willingness to sacrifice everything he'd built for the chance to build something new with her. "I love you," she said finally, the words carrying the weight of acceptance and commitment. "But I'm terrified of what this means for both of us." "It means we start over," Anson replied, pulling her into his arms. "It means I stop being the man who destroys things and learn to be the man who builds them. It means I choose love over fear, connection over isolation. And if you can't, if the violence and the darkness are too much a part of who you are, then you'll teach me how to be better," he said, kissing her forehead gently. "The same way you've been teaching me for weeks without either of us realizing it." The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more desperate, full of promises and possibilities. Caroline's hands tangled in his hair as he pulled her closer, and for a moment, the danger and uncertainty faded away, leaving only the certainty that they would face whatever came next together. "I love you," Anson whispered against her lips. "And I swear to you, no one will ever threaten you or your family again." "I love you too," Caroline replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "And I believe you, but promise me something, anything. Promise me that when you walk away from all of this, you're not walking away from the parts of yourself that made you who you are. You're not a monster, Anson. You're a man who's survived terrible things and found ways to help others survive too." The words hit him like a revelation. For 18 years, he'd believed that his darkness was something to be hidden, that his capacity for violence made him unworthy of love or redemption. But Caroline saw something different: strength that could be redirected, power that could be used to build instead of destroy. "I promise," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'll find a way to be the man you deserve, while still being the man who can protect the people I love." As they held each other in the darkness of her bedroom, with his security team maintaining watch outside and the weight of his decisions settling over them both, Anson felt something shift inside his chest. The cold, calculating machine he'd become was finally giving way to something warmer, more human. The Shadow King was ready to step into the light, and love, he realized, was the only crown worth wearing. The meeting with the Kozlov brothers took place in neutral territory, an abandoned factory in Queens that had once been the site of peace negotiations between rival families. The rusted metal and broken concrete created the perfect backdrop for what Anson knew would be his final confrontation with the men who had dared to threaten Caroline. Dmitry Kozlov was a bear of a man with dead eyes and hands that had personally ended more lives than most people could count. His brother Yuri was smaller but more dangerous, possessing the kind of intelligence that made him lethal in ways that brute force never could. Together they had built an organization that survived on fear and violence, and they saw Anson's legitimate business success as a weakness to be exploited. "Anson Wright," Dimitri said, his accent thick with the brutality of his homeland. "The Shadow King himself. You look different somehow, softer." Anson arrived with Vincent and 2 other trusted men, but he knew they were walking into a trap. The Kozlovs had chosen this location carefully, positioning their own people in the shadows where they could control the outcome of any confrontation. "Dimitri," Anson replied, his voice carrying the chill that had once made grown men confess their deepest fears. "You wanted to meet. Here I am." "I wanted to discuss your retirement," Dimitri continued, his smile revealing teeth that had been broken and poorly repaired. "Your legitimate businesses are making you weak, vulnerable. Your woman is proof of that." At the mention of Caroline, Anson's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. The movement was subtle, but in a room full of predators, subtlety was a language everyone understood. "Careful, Dimitri," Anson said, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "You're about to cross a line you can't uncross." "The line was crossed the moment you brought civilians into our world," Yuri interjected, his voice smoother than his brother's but no less dangerous. "She's pretty. You're Caroline. Smart too. Would hate for something to happen to her." The threat hung in the air like a death sentence. Anson felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold fury that had made him legendary in the shadow world. But this wasn't about territory or profit. This was about protecting the only good thing in his life. "You touch her," Anson said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, "and I'll burn your entire organization to the ground. Every business, every safe house, every person who's ever taken orders from you. I'll turn your empire into ash and scatter it to the wind." Dimitri's laughter was like gravel in a blender. "You think love makes you strong. It makes you weak. It gives us exactly what we need to destroy you." "Try it," Anson replied, and something in his tone made even the Kozlov brothers pause. "But remember, I know where your children go to school. I know where your mother lives in Brighton Beach. I know about your girlfriend's apartment in Manhattan, and your brother's wife's jewelry store in Brooklyn. You threaten my family, and I'll show you what real war looks like." The meeting ended with no resolution, but both sides understood that lines had been drawn. As Anson left the factory, he knew that the next few days would determine whether he could successfully leave his old life behind, or whether he would have to destroy everything he'd built to protect what mattered most. The war lasted 3 days, but it felt like an eternity. Anson's organization, built on loyalty and fear in equal measure, proved more resilient than the Kozlovs had anticipated. Years of careful planning and strategic alliances paid off as allies emerged from unexpected places to support his cause. Vincent coordinated the campaign with military precision, using every resource at their disposal to systematically dismantle the Kozlov empire. Safe houses were raided, businesses were shuttered, and key lieutenants found themselves facing choices between loyalty and survival. "The Kozlovs are finished," Vincent reported after the final confrontation. "Dimitri's dead, Yuri's in the wind, and their organization is scattered. But boss, the heat is intense. Half the other families are worried about what this means for them." Anson stood in his office, looking out at the city that had been his kingdom for 18 years. The victory had come at a cost. Blood had been spilled, alliances had been broken, and the authorities were asking questions that would be difficult to answer. "What's the word on the street?" he asked. "They're scared," Vincent admitted. "You took apart the Kozlovs in 3 days. That kind of power makes people nervous. Some are talking about a preemptive strike before you decide to come after them next." "And what do you think?" Vincent studied his boss's face, noting the weariness that had settled into his features. "I think you're done with all of this. I think you've found something more important than power." The aftermath of the war brought a strange kind of peace to Anson's world. The Kozlov organization had been completely destroyed, their territories absorbed by other families or abandoned entirely. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that violence had been necessary to secure Caroline's safety. "The FBI is asking questions," Vincent reported during their morning meeting. "They can't prove anything, but they're definitely interested in the sudden disappearance of the Kozlov brothers." Anson nodded, having expected this development. "How much heat are we facing?" "Enough to make the other families nervous. Word is that half of them want you gone before you bring too much attention to their operations." "Then I'll go," Anson said, his decision made with the certainty that had always characterized his leadership. "It's time to end this anyway." Vincent stared at him, disbelief clear in his scarred features. "Just like that. You built this empire from nothing, boss. You've got more power than anyone in the city, and I'm walking away from it for something better," Anson replied, his voice carrying a peace that Vincent had never heard before. "The shadow world served its purpose. It kept me alive, gave me power, helped me survive. But I don't need to survive anymore. I need to live." "The girl? Her name is Caroline," Anson corrected gently. "And yes, for her, for the life we're going to build together, for the man I want to become instead of the man I had to be." The process of dismantling his shadow empire took weeks of careful planning and negotiation. Territories were transferred to trusted allies, businesses were sold or shut down, and debts were settled with the kind of finality that left no room for future complications. "You sure about this?" Vincent asked as they oversaw the dissolution of the last major operation. "Once you walk away, there's no coming back. The families won't trust you, and the streets won't fear you." "Good," Anson replied, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders with each severed connection. "Fear was never what I wanted anyway. I just thought it was all I could have." The legitimate businesses remained, providing more than enough wealth to support the life he wanted to build with Caroline. But the shadow empire that had defined his existence for 18 years was finally gone, dissolved as completely as if it had never existed. "What about the men who worked for you?" Caroline asked one evening as they sat in his penthouse watching the city lights twinkle below. "Do they have somewhere to go?" "Vincent's taking over security for the legitimate businesses," Anson replied, his arm tightening around her. "The others are finding their own paths. Some are going legitimate, others are joining different organizations. I made sure everyone had options. And you? Any regrets?" Anson considered the question, thinking about the power he'd given up, the fear he'd once commanded, the respect that had been built on violence and intimidation. "Only that it took me so long to realize there was another way to live." The phone call came on a quiet Sunday morning, 6 weeks after the dissolution of his shadow empire. Anson was making breakfast, a skill he'd recently discovered he enjoyed, when his phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in 18 years. "Anson?" The voice was older, gravelly with emotion, and what sounded like years of regret. "Son, is that really you?" Anson's hand tightened on the phone, his entire body tensing at the sound of his father's voice. "Dad, I've been looking for you for years. Ever since I realized what a terrible mistake I made." 18 years too late," Anson replied, his voice carrying the coldness that had once been his trademark. "I know. God, I know. But son, I need to tell you something. About Helen. About what really happened after you left." Caroline appeared in the doorway, sensing the tension in his voice. Anson reached for her hand, drawing strength from her touch as his father continued. "I found out Helen was only with me for the money," David Wright said, his voice breaking. "She'd been stealing from the company, manipulating me, using me to get access to the family fortune. When I discovered the truth, she disappeared with half my assets." "And you expect me to feel sorry for you?" Anson asked, though there was less anger in his voice than there might have been months earlier. "I expect you to hate me," his father replied. "I failed you as a father. I chose a woman over my own son, and I've been living with the consequences ever since. But I've been trying to find you, to make amends, to tell you how sorry I am." "Why now?" "Because I'm getting old, and I can't die knowing that I never tried to fix what I broke. Because you're my son, and I love you, and I was too blind and proud to see what she was doing to you." Anson closed his eyes, feeling years of pain and anger warring with the child inside who had always wanted his father's love. "I don't know if I can forgive you." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," David said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance to know the man you've become. To maybe have some small part in your life before it's too late." Caroline squeezed his hand, her eyes full of understanding and encouragement. "Meet with him," she whispered. "You deserve to know the truth." "There's someone I want you to meet," Anson said finally. "Someone who's become very important to me." The meeting took place in a small cafe in Brooklyn, neutral ground where old wounds could be examined without the weight of history pressing down on them. David Wright was older than Anson remembered, gray-haired and worn by years of regret, but his eyes held the same warmth they'd had when Anson was a child. "You look like your mother," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be so proud of what you've accomplished." "Don't," Anson warned, though the word carried less venom than it might have before Caroline entered his life. "She would be," David insisted. "What you've built, who you've become, the woman you found. She always said you had your mother's heart and your grandfather's strength." Caroline spoke softly, her voice carrying the warmth that had first attracted Anson to her. "Mr. Wright," Anson has built something beautiful from nothing. That takes incredible courage. Courage he inherited from his mother, David replied, and resilience he learned on his own, because I failed to teach him what a father should. As the conversation continued, Anson felt the ice around his heart beginning to crack. His father wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was offering truth, and somehow that was more valuable than any apology could have been. I have a proposal, David said finally. I want to leave you everything. The company, the assets, all of it. It should have been yours from the beginning. I don't want your money, Anson said automatically. Then use it to help people, David replied. Use it to make sure other kids don't go through what you did. Don't let my mistakes destroy the chance for us to be family again. Anson looked at Caroline, seeing the hope in her eyes, the belief that healing was possible even after years of pain. I'll think about it. It was a start. 6 months later, Anson stood in the conference room of the newly established Wright Foundation, watching Caroline address a group of social workers and child advocates. She had left her auditing firm to run the foundation, and her passion for helping vulnerable children had given both of them a new purpose. The foundation's mission is simple, Caroline explained to the assembled group, to ensure that no child faces the streets alone and that no family struggles without support when they need it most. Anson felt his phone buzz with a text from Vincent, who now ran security for both the foundation and the legitimate businesses. 4 more families housed this week. You're going soft, boss. Anson smiled, typing back, good. The foundation had grown beyond anything he'd expected, using the resources from his father's company and the profits from his legitimate businesses. They had created a network of support that reached into every corner of the city. Children who had aged out of foster care found housing and job training. Families facing eviction received emergency assistance. Kids who reminded him of his younger self were given opportunities that he'd never had. Penny for your thoughts? Caroline asked, settling into his lap after the meeting had ended. Just thinking about how different everything is, Anson replied, his arms wrapping around her naturally. A year ago I was a man who ruled through fear. Now I'm someone who builds through love. You were always that man, Caroline said, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. You just forgot for a while. Caroline? Yes. Marry me. She pulled back to look at him, surprise and joy warring in her expression. Is that a proposal? It's a statement of fact, Anson replied, his voice carrying the certainty that had once made him feared in the shadow world. I love you. I want to spend my life with you. I want to build a future where kids like I was have hope instead of desperation. And if I said no, then I'd ask again tomorrow, and the next day, and every day until you said yes. Caroline's laugh was musical, filled with the joy that had become the soundtrack of his new life. Well, when you put it that way, yes. The kiss that followed tasted like new beginnings and second chances, like the promise of a future built on love instead of fear. As they held each other in the conference room, surrounded by photos of the families they'd helped, Anson felt the last vestiges of his old life fall away. The Shadow King was truly dead, replaced by a man who had learned that the greatest power came not from instilling fear, but from inspiring hope. And as he looked into Caroline's eyes, he saw his future reflected back at him. A future where love conquered all, where redemption was possible, and where the boy who had once run from his father's house had finally found his way home. I want to build a future where kids like I was have hope, he whispered against her lips, where they know they're loved, where they have chances I never had. We'll build it together, Caroline promised. All of it, the foundation, the family, the life we both deserve. As the sun set over the city that had once been his kingdom, Anson Wright held the woman he loved and felt truly powerful for the first time in his life. Not because he commanded fear, but because he had chosen love. And love, he had learned, was the only empire worth building. The gardens of St. Mary's Children's Home had been transformed into something magical, but they retained the humble beauty that had once provided comfort to countless forgotten children. White roses climbed the weathered brick walls, their petals catching the afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. Wooden benches arranged in neat rows faced a simple arch adorned with jasmine and baby's breath, creating an aisle that led not just to an altar, but to a future neither Anson nor Caroline had dared to dream possible. Anson stood beneath the arch, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time in as many minutes. The black tuxedo was perfectly tailored, but he felt more nervous than he had before any business negotiation or shadow world confrontation. Beside him, His father, David Wright, looked distinguished in his own formal wear, the silver at his temples catching the light as he offered his son a reassuring smile. "You look like you're facing a firing squad," David observed, his voice carrying the gentle humor that had slowly returned to their relationship over the past year. "I feel like it," Anson admitted, his hands trembling slightly as he looked out over the assembled guests. "What if I'm not good enough for her? What if I can't be the husband she deserves?" David placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, the gesture carrying 18 years of regret and hope for redemption. "Son, she chose you. After knowing everything about your past, everything you've done, she chose you. Trust her judgment." The guests were an eclectic mix that perfectly represented the journey Anson had taken. Vincent sat in the front row, looking remarkably civilized in a navy suit, his scarred face softened by genuine happiness for his former boss. Members of the Wright Foundation board occupied several rows, their presence a testament to the legitimate empire Anson had built from the ashes of his shadow kingdom. Children from the home ran between the seats, their laughter adding music to the afternoon air. Caroline's family filled the left side of the garden, her mother Patricia dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief while her siblings fidgeted in their formal clothes. Tommy, now 13 and taller than he'd been when Anson first met him, served as one of the ushers, his chest puffed with pride at the important role he'd been given. "She's coming," David whispered, and Anson's attention snapped to the entrance of the garden. Caroline appeared in the doorway like a vision brought to life, her wedding dress a masterpiece of simple elegance that made her natural beauty shine even brighter. The ivory silk flowed around her like liquid moonlight, and her auburn hair was styled in loose waves that framed her face perfectly. But it was her eyes, those gray-green depths that had first seen through his carefully constructed armor, that made Anson's breath catch in his throat. She walked down the aisle alone, having chosen to give herself away, rather than be given by another. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Caroline had always been her own person, strong and independent, and her choice to marry Anson was hers alone to make. As she reached the altar, Anson stepped forward to take her hand, and the simple contact sent warmth through his entire body. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "So are you," she replied, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready since the moment you walked into my office and changed everything." Father Rodriguez, who had served the children's home for over 30 years, stepped forward to begin the ceremony. His weathered face held the wisdom of someone who had witnessed countless transformations, and his voice carried the authority of absolute faith. "Dearly beloved," he began, his words carrying across the garden like a benediction. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other the completion they never knew they were seeking." The ceremony proceeded with the timeless rituals that had bound couples together for centuries, but when the time came for personal vows, the garden fell silent with anticipation. Anson had spent weeks writing and rewriting his words, trying to capture the magnitude of what Caroline meant to him. "Caroline," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions churning in his chest. "Before you walked into my life, I was a man who lived in shadows, who trusted no one, and loved nothing. I thought strength meant being hard, untouchable, invulnerable to pain. You showed me that real strength isn't about being hard, it's about being brave enough to be vulnerable." His voice grew stronger as he continued, the words flowing from his heart, with absolute honesty. "You didn't just save me from the darkness I'd chosen to live in. You showed me that the light was always there, waiting for me to be courageous enough to step into it. You've made me want to be better, to build instead of destroy, to love instead of fear." Tears streamed down Caroline's face as she listened to his words, and Anson felt his own eyes growing wet with emotion. He no longer tried to hide. "I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of your love," he continued. "I promise to protect you and your family, to support your dreams, to be the partner you deserve. I promise to never let the man I was overshadow the man you've helped me become." When it was Caroline's turn, she took his hands in hers, her touch grounding him in the present moment. "Anson," she began, her voice clear and strong, "you've shown me that love isn't about perfection, it's about growth. You've taught me that the most beautiful hearts are often the ones that have been broken and healed, that the strongest souls are forged in the fire of adversity." She paused, looking directly into his eyes with the fearlessness that had first attracted him to her. "You're not the Shadow King anymore. You're not the man who ruled through fear or lived in isolation. You're simply my heart, walking around outside my body, and I love every part of who you've become. I promise to stand beside you as we build our future together, Caroline continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I promise to support you in your mission to help children who were once like you. I promise to love you through every transformation, every challenge, every moment of doubt, because you're not just my husband, you're my partner in creating something beautiful from the ashes of what was. Father Rodriguez smiled as he moved to the final portion of the ceremony. By the power vested in me, and in the presence of these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. The kiss that sealed their union was tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. As they broke apart, the garden erupted in cheers and applause, but Anson only had eyes for Caroline, his wife, his partner, his salvation. Vincent was the first to reach them, his scarred face split by a grin that transformed his usually intimidating appearance. Congratulations, boss. You found something worth more than all the power in the world. I found everything, Anson replied, his arm wrapped firmly around Caroline's waist. Everything I never knew I was looking for. The reception that followed was held in the same garden, tables laden with food and laughter filling the air as the sun began to set. Anson and Caroline moved through their guests like a couple who had been married for years, comfortable in each other's presence, and radiating the kind of happiness that made everyone around them smile. Speech, someone called out, and soon the entire gathering was chanting for the groom to address his guests. Anson stood, pulling Caroline up beside him, and the garden fell quiet. A year ago, he began, his voice carrying easily across the space. I was a man who thought power meant controlling others, that strength meant standing alone. Tonight, I'm surrounded by people who've shown me that real power comes from love. Real strength comes from community. He looked down at Caroline, his heart full to bursting. My wife has taught me that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose light over darkness. And all of you, our family, our friends, our community, have shown me that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the work. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Anson barely heard it. He was too busy looking into Caroline's eyes, seeing his future reflected back at him, a future filled with love, purpose, and the kind of joy he'd never thought he deserved. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Anson and Caroline stood together in the garden where it all began, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The children's home that had once represented the worst period of his life had become the setting for the best day of it. Ready to start our forever? Caroline asked, her hand finding his in the darkness. With you, Anson replied, kissing her softly. I'm ready for anything. 1 year later, Anson stood in the nursery of their brownstone home, watching Caroline rock their newborn daughter to sleep. The baby had Caroline's eyes and his dark hair, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The room was painted in soft pastels, with a mobile of stars and moons casting gentle shadows on the walls. She's perfect, he whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and disturb the peaceful scene. She's ours, Caroline replied, her voice filled with the wonder that had characterized every moment since their daughter's birth 3 days earlier. Have you thought about what you want to tell her about your past? Anson settled into the chair beside Caroline's rocking chair, his hand reaching out to gently touch his daughter's tiny fingers. I want to tell her the truth, that her father was once lost, but her mother helped him find his way home. That people can change, that love is stronger than fear, that every story can have a happy ending if you're brave enough to fight for it. His phone buzzed softly with a text message. The name on the screen, Dad, still felt strange after so many years of silence, but the warmth that filled his chest at seeing it was genuine. Board meeting went well, the message read. The Foundation's expansion into 3 new cities is approved. Your mother would be proud of everything you've built. For the first time in 22 years, the mention of his mother brought comfort instead of pain. She would be proud of the man he'd become, the woman he'd married, the life they'd built together. The scared 10-year-old boy who had lost her in that hospital room had grown into a father who would never let his own daughter feel alone or unloved. What did your father say? Caroline asked, noting the soft smile on his face. That Mom would be proud, Anson replied, his voice thick with emotion. And I think she would be. Not of the empire I built in the shadows, but of this, our family, the foundation, the children we're helping. Caroline shifted the baby to her other arm, the movement natural and graceful. She would be proud of your courage. It takes incredible strength to walk away from everything you knew to build something better. I had help, Anson said, leaning over to kiss his wife's forehead. I had you. Their daughter stirred in Caroline's arms, making the soft sounds that newborns make when they're dreaming. Anson wondered what she was dreaming about, what hopes and fears would shape her future, what challenges she would face, what triumphs she would celebrate. "I want to be different from my father," he said quietly. "I want her to know every day that she's loved, that she's wanted, that she'll never have to face the world alone." "She'll know," Caroline assured him, "because she'll have parents who learned from their past instead of being defined by it. She'll have a foundation that helps children like her father once was. She'll have a legacy of love instead of fear." As if responding to her mother's words, the baby opened her eyes, gray-green like Caroline's but with flecks of gold that caught the nursery light. She looked up at her parents with the kind of trust that only innocent children possess, and Anson felt his heart expand with a love he'd never known was possible. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his finger tracing her tiny cheek. "Welcome to your world. It's going to be beautiful." The foundation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined possible. In the year since their wedding, they had helped over 200 families, housed 60 children who had aged out of foster care, and provided college scholarships to dozens of young people who reminded him of his younger self. The work was challenging, sometimes heartbreaking, but always rewarding in ways that his shadow empire had never been. "Vincent called earlier," Caroline said, her voice soft in the quiet nursery. 3 more families were housed this week. "That brings our total to 25 so far this month." "Good," Anson replied, his attention focused on his daughter's face. "Every child deserves a safe place to sleep, a family to love them, a future to dream about." "Look at you," Caroline said, her voice filled with affection. "From shadow king to devoted father. Your transformation is complete." "Not complete," Anson corrected, his eyes meeting hers. "Still happening. Every day with you, every child we help, every moment with her. It's all part of becoming the man I was meant to be." The baby yawned, a tiny sound that made both parents smile. Caroline stood carefully, carrying their daughter to the crib that had been handcrafted by one of the teenagers from the Foundation's job training program. As she placed the baby down, Anson wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, both of them watching their daughter settle into sleep. "What are you thinking about?" Caroline asked, leaning back against his chest. "How far we've come," Anson replied, his voice filled with wonder. "A year ago, I was a man without a family, without hope, without any idea that this kind of happiness was possible. Now I have everything I never knew I wanted. And what's that? You, her, this life we've built together, the knowledge that we're making a difference, that we're helping children who were once like me find their way to something better." Caroline turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his face. "I love you, Anson Wright, all of you, the man you were, the man you became, the father you're going to be." "I love you too," he replied, kissing her softly, "more than I ever thought possible." As they stood together in the soft glow of the nursery lamp, Anson reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared boy who had run from his father's house had become a man who'd built an empire of shadows, only to tear it down for something infinitely more valuable. Love, he had learned, was the greatest empire of all. It couldn't be conquered or controlled, bought or sold. It could only be given and received, nurtured and protected, shared and celebrated. And in the arms of his wife, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in her crib, Anson Wright had found his true kingdom at last. The Shadow King was dead. In his place stood a man who had learned that the greatest strength came not from inspiring fear, but from inspiring hope. Not from standing alone, but from building community. Not from taking what he wanted, but from giving what he could. And as the stars continued their eternal dance outside the nursery window, Anson held his wife close and whispered a promise that would guide the rest of his days. "We're going to change the world, one child at a time, one family at a time, one act of love at a time." Love had conquered all, and the future had never looked brighter. My dear family, as I finish this story, I'm reminded why I do this. Every late night, every hour of research, every prayer for you, it's because I believe in the power of love to transform even the darkest hearts. Anson's journey from Shadow King to loving father shows us that no matter how far we've fallen, love can always bring us home. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. And remember, your story isn't over yet. The best chapters might still be unwritten. If you enjoyed this story, quickly hit that subscribe button. Like, comment the moment you felt most in this story, and share with someone who needs to see it. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love.